We're going to continue this series that we've been doing in Hebrews, and we're going to make our way into chapter 10 this morning. I actually think, though, that we could do a little summary before we really get into it. The author of this book is going to conclude an argument that he's been building for a few chapters now. And so the passage that we're going to go over this morning, Hebrews 10, 19 through 25, is the last part of that argument that he's been making. So we do kind of need to remember what we've been talking about in order to have a proper context for what he wants to say. And one of the things that we've recently talked about is the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was a portable tent-like structure that the Jews were supposed to carry around with them in the wilderness. And so this is the floor plan view of it. All right. And so it's like a rectangle, and the outside is pretty much a wall with no roof. But it does have a curtain or a gate at the one end, like to your right, if you're looking at the picture on the screen. And the smaller rectangle inside of it, like sort of center left, is the holy place. And the even smaller rectangle on the inside left of that is the Holy of Holies. And so we did all of this in detail last week. But in this Holy of Holies area was where God symbolically dwelt. And so this whole arrangement, this whole series of rooms within rooms and things like that was intended to communicate and to symbolize a pretty simple thing. But it was something that was really important to God, so it was important for him to communicate. And so this is meant to show us the problem of sin and the barrier that it creates between us and God. And so God is this like righteous, morally perfect being, and the Israelites just weren't. And so they weren't able to come into the presence of God because they were impure. They were defiled. And so no Israelites that weren't priests were going inside this tent, right? Like inside the part that had a roof. They had to stay in the courtyard area or even outside of it. And just to further illustrate this, there's a series of physical barriers between the people and God. And so only certain people could go through the outermost gate at the entrance to the courtyard. And then there's another barrier to keep people that aren't priests from entering the holy place. And then all around this place where God symbolically dwelt, there was this huge, heavy curtain or veil. And so all of this is intended to communicate that God is in this place here, and you are over here with all of these things in between you and God. And so it's all meant to illustrate this idea that we brought up last week. And the idea, there we go, that is that the people are like on one side, right? We've done all these things that fall short of the glory of God. And there's this huge chasm between us and God. And the separation is caused by sin. And so God has a solution to the problem. And the tabernacle represents sort of the setup and then the solution of the problem. So he has a solution to this problem of sin. And the way that he communicated the reality of that solution was to have the Israelites give animal sacrifices. So they would actually take a live animal and kill it and take the animal's blood and show it to God. And so instead of the people having to pay the price for their sin, that's spiritual death or alienation from God, the animal symbolically pays the price with a literal death. And after that was done, after the sacrifices had been made, once a year, the high priest could enter into the presence of God. Okay, and so, there we go. Sorry about that. So they could go into the presence of God, but they had to approach God through the sacrificial system that God set up. And so it's a little bit like, like when a Secret Service agent throws himself between a gunman and the president, like the lamb takes the bullet that's ours to take. And that's a little bit like what we're talking about here. And so the thing is, and we've been emphasizing this the whole time that we've been in Hebrews, this whole sacrificial system with the animals and the tabernacle and all that stuff, it wasn't a permanent solution to the problem of sin. And in fact, it wouldn't take much trouble at all to make the case that it was no solution at all. Okay, it just laid the groundwork so that we would have an understanding of what the solution would look like when it came. And so all these sacrifices are like a foreshadowing that pointed towards a future sacrifice, a human sacrifice to pay for human sin, a sacrifice provided by God himself, a sacrifice by God himself, so that it would be like universal and pure and effective. And so if you have trouble watching the torture and the crucifixion of Christ, like in the Passion movie or something like that, try to remember just what he was and what he was accomplishing when he did that. All right, he was a pure sacrifice for all things, for all time, that all people have done or been that fall short of the glory of God. All right, so there's a major difference between Christ and the animal sacrifices that came before him. The animal sacrifices symbolized the removal of sin, and the death of Christ actually paid for and removed the effects of sin on our relationship with God. All right, so what did John the Baptist say when he saw Christ walking towards him? Right? Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. So this gap between ourselves and God is bridged. And it isn't bridged by dead animals. And it isn't bridged by our good deeds. It's bridged by the blood and the proof of death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And so then, just like the high priest could go into the presence of God, all right, now we can all go directly into the presence of God. And so the way is open to anyone that asks that the sacrifice of Christ stand for them. And that pretty much brings us up to speed to get into today's message. But before we actually read it, just want us to remember that books like the book of Hebrews were written to a group of people, some of whom couldn't read. And so they didn't make a bunch of copies of the book and pass it out to everybody. They had one copy, and they read it aloud at little meetings. Not terribly different from how, I'm presenting something to you here this morning. And so there's a group of Jews that are sitting around and they're hearing the message from this book. And these are guys that have been relying on the sacrificial system as a way to relate to God. And they're hearing this message, and it sort of begins to dawn on them that the author is saying that their sins are paid for once and for all. Not only do they not have to sacrifice animals anymore, but it would be wrong for them to sacrifice animals anymore. All right, so they all have this full, unfettered access to God. And that is the point at which we're picking up this book, in this chapter in verse 19. And so those of them that were accepting of this message that they were getting had to sort of be asking themselves a question. If all of this is true, then how should we respond to what's been done for us? Now, what do we do as Christians, as believers, as followers of the way, whatever, right? If you accept this one and only sacrifice of Jesus. And if that's the question on the mind of the Hebrews that got this letter from, like, maybe Paul, then they're in luck, all right? Because that's what the next 6 or 7 verses is going to answer. And it's actually a very cool set of verses that sort of lays out what it means to live a Christian life. So we're talking about, like, responses to the gospel is the point. First, we're going to make sure that we get a principle that's pretty clear in the reading and sort of colors our attitude as of our approach to God. But we're just going to start by reading the passage. So this is the whole passage that we're going to do this morning. It says, "Therefore, brethren, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." So there's kind of a lot there, all right? But we're just going to point something out before we tear this thing apart. Before we can even begin to do the things that he spells out for us to do in this passage, all right, the things that he's spelling out for us to do are pretty clear, all right? So there's let us draw near, let us hold fast, let us consider, all right? These are the things that he's telling us we should do, okay? But before we can begin to do that, the author's trying to make sure that we recognize what God has done for us. So notice that he says, since God has done this, and since God has done that. Then and only on the basis of what God has done, do we move forward into what God wants us to do. And so in other words, like, the things that we do for God are based directly on and flow from the things that God has done for us. So it's actually pretty clear just from the grammar, I would say. You don't really need to be a theology expert to see this. So because God has initiated and done these things, as a response to that, he would like for us to do these other things. So it's an absolutely critical principle that you get a hold of. So let's chop up the first part of this passage where it mentions a couple of things that Jesus has done for us. And so these are the things that, like, since Christ has done these things. So what is it that he's done? Well, he's given us direct access to God. All right, the verse 19 said we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus. And then the passage goes on to say by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil. So he's saying that we have the confidence to do what no one else has been able to do before. All right, for the entirety of the time that God has been revealing himself to his people, almost no one ever was allowed to come into his presence. All right, but now we could actually enter into the presence of God. And we're able to do that because of what Christ did. All right, so, like, you ever stood very, very close to the train tracks when a fast-moving train goes by? So, like, the ground shakes and there's all this noise and wind and this giant thing is just flying by and you can't help but feel a little bit like maybe I should step back. All right, so it just feels like you're too close to something that could kill you without even wanting to. Like the train doesn't care whether you're there or not. It feels dangerous. And so some of you are going, this is why women live longer than men. But that's a little bit like what a lot of this audience has to feel like about being close to God. Okay, these are people that have grown up inside of this sacrificial system where getting close to God or touching the ark is dangerous. So they're not even sure that they want into the presence of God. In the Old Testament, if you walked into the presence of God in the tabernacle without doing it right and being the right guy, they like swept you up with a shop vac. Okay, so this author is saying that it doesn't work like that anymore. You can have access to God. And so this is what it means to be a Christian. Christ leads us into the presence of God based on what he has done, not on what we have done. So the other thing that this passage says that Jesus has done for us is that he's our high priest. So even in the Old Testament, a high priest was a little bit like a defense lawyer. Okay, he's a mediator between us and God. And so he continually goes to God on our behalf to lay his payment down in place of the separation of death that we deserve. So this is the role of the priest in the Old Testament, to approach God on behalf of the people who are not able to approach God. So that's what Jesus does for us continuously. And so, these are pretty awesome things that Jesus has done for us. And our normal take on religion is that, we do some sort of ritual, or we do some behavior, or we subscribe to some system of morality that merits these certain things from God. But what's being described here is very, very different from that. We generally think that if we follow the rule in like section 2, code C, rule 7, then God's going to respond to us in the way that we want him to. We think of God a little bit like, the IRS. If I complete my forms accurately and submit them on time, then I get my return. But God doesn't work that way at all. So we're confronted in the Bible with a God that takes the initiative and does the things that need to be done because we can't. God loves us no matter what. All right, God provides for us no matter what. And it's similar to the love that we have for our children, but God is better at it than we are. All right, he's more unconditional about it than we are. So this is actually quite incredible, and it's really unique. This is a God that's worthy of our praise. Okay, it's not based on what we do, it's based on what he has done for us. And so this is the primary difference between Christianity of the Bible, the Christianity that the Bible puts forth, not Christianity as we experience it most of the time. But this is the difference between the biblical Christianity and other world religions. All right. Just the way that most of us have been exposed to other religions. But we can't forget this principle. All right. That all of the things that we're supposed to do are a response to what God has already done for us. So now we're going to look at the ways that we should respond that are listed in this passage. And the first is this idea that we should draw near to God. In verse 22, it says, "Let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." So there's a bunch of different images here, but let's talk for a moment about how the world views the idea of drawing near to God. All right, so what about this idea that you can hang out in some dark cathedral or church and get closer to God that way? All right, the idea that there's a sacred space where we can get closer to God. Okay, well, it is true that these places can sometimes like produce a sense of awe or majesty in us. All right, that's valid. How about secluding yourself with nature and silence so that you can develop like a God consciousness, or maybe something like yoga or meditation. Okay, maybe you have some ritual prayer that you repeat that you learned as a kid that makes you feel closer to God. All right, so these are some of the common pictures that we have about what it looks like to draw near to God. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But the Bible never once in the New Testament talks about places or meditation techniques or chanted prayers or ritual prayers. There's nothing like that we're given for a prescription for drawing near to God. All right, so God thinks about this, and we should too, in terms of relationship. All right, when God talks in Revelations 3 about drawing near to us, he describes himself as standing on your front doorstep and knocking on your door and asking if he can come in for dinner. For God, drawing near to you means interpersonal communication and relationship, like rich interactions. That's what God wants. And that just like leads directly to the idea of prayer. So the Bible defines drawing near to God as regular interpersonal communication and prayer with God. And so when the Bible does give us tips on how to draw near to God, we do not get instructions on rituals or disciplines. We get things that are aimed at our heart attitude, like this. Okay? So it says that we need to have a sincere or true heart. Okay? So you guys ever watch TV evangelists? Or even pay attention to the way that like preachers or holy men are portrayed in movies or TV. All right? So they are many times the absolute opposite of what this is saying. Okay, so to draw near with a sincere heart is to draw near in honesty, in truth, who you really are. Talking to God about how things really are. And so I was going to bring a clip of like TV preachers just to illustrate my point. But it's over the top, man. Like it's just totally not necessary. You know what I'm talking about. The funny posture that they take, the funny voices that they use when they're talking, shaking fists and pounding on the pulpit, all right? So do you think that they're really like that when they're at home? Is that what sincerity really looks like? So why do you think they do it? Why do you think they have to drag out the Jesus? Right? Do you think that they think that God is more likely to pay attention, or maybe God is really drawn to a particular like speech pattern? Or maybe it has to do with the fact that they're putting on a show. All right, so I don't actually know what they're thinking, but I do know that God is saying that he doesn't want to talk to some idealized version of a Christian, or to have some fake version of you or who you think you ought to be. He wants to talk to you just as you are. So, like, read David's interactions with God in the book of Psalms. When he's happy, he tells God that he's happy. When he's sad, when he's angry, when he's not sure that God is going to honor his word, when he's disappointed, when he's in the middle of like heinous sin, okay, he just tells God what's up. So the book of Psalms is a very good model of how to draw near to God with sincerity. So in the Old Testament, God lamented the superficial types of posturing that we're talking about here. All right. So in Isaiah 29, God says, "This people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me. And their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote." Right? And God says that's not what he's looking for. All right, that's not what he wants. He doesn't want posturing. He's just looking for the real you. So the other thing that we need to remember in order to draw near to God is to depend on Jesus to make us acceptable to God. So this is what he's talking about when he says, "In full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." Full assurance of faith. So this audience was not sure that they could go without the sacrificing and the rituals. And he's saying that they need to be fully assured that what Jesus has done is complete and it's sufficient. It is finished. All right. So he uses this language here about being sprinkled and washed. And so these are references to the Old Testament practices, like where it says in Leviticus that the high priest would have to wash before he went into the presence of God. And then he would have to take the blood from an animal and sprinkle it on parts of the tabernacle and the ark and stuff like that. So washing and sprinkling were needed to symbolically cleanse. And this author is saying that we've all already been washed and we've all already been sprinkled. We've all been made right in the eyes of God, and we are welcome in the presence of God. And on the basis of knowing that, not on the basis of what we've done, we need to draw near to God. And I wonder how many of us actually have this assurance that we're already acceptable to God and that we can just go to him. And I think maybe most of us could say that we believe this, but, do we live it out? And so when we are short with our spouse or impatient with our kids or express our displeasure to the drivers around us with various hand gestures, do we still feel like we can draw near to God? All right, so why is it that we can easily draw near to God when we're behaving as we think we should? But we find it much more difficult when we're not quite our best self. And so even if we're able to communicate that we don't believe it theologically, many of us live like our worthiness to relate to God hinges on our behavior. And if there's one thing that I hope everybody hears this morning, it's this. Okay? We are never qualified to enter into God's presence on the basis of our behavior. It doesn't make any difference how good you are. I don't care if you led a crusade, okay, or like an entire generation of people come to Christ because of what you do today. All right, you are just as unworthy to be in God's presence as the worst person on their worst day. Okay? But there's a flip side to this, and that is that we are always qualified. No matter what's going on, no matter what we have done, we are always qualified to enter into the presence of God based on what Jesus Christ has done for us. All right? This is huge. And this is a pretty big distinction. All right, so that's one response to what God has done. And so there's two more that the text gives us. This is the next one. It says to hold fast to the confession of your hope. The hope that he's talking about is it's a pretty broad topic. He's talking about our salvation, that we're going to get new bodies, that we're going to be reunited with loved ones, that we're going to enjoy the creativity of God, that we will engage in rewarding work, that we will be consciously alive and growing and learning for all of eternity. Okay, it's a pretty broad hope, but that is the hope that he says that we should hold on to. Okay, so he who promised is faithful. Okay, we can hold on to it because God has already proven himself faithful. He's already kept a bunch of promises. And so remember that the audience for this book was taking a lot of heat for being Christians. They're Jews who are being ostracized from their community for rejecting Judaism. Their possessions are being seized. Some of them are being killed. All right, that's why he says that they need to hold fast without wavering. Okay, so without wavering means like something that's upright and vertical, that doesn't wobble. All right, I'm sure that lots of us have some experience with things that don't wobble. All right, you ever run into something that doesn't move at all when you hit it? All right, there's a lot of stories I could tell here. In 5th grade, the weather was bad at the school that I went to, so we had recess inside the gym, and we're playing kickball. Somebody kicked the ball, and it went up in the air, and I could see that if I pushed pretty hard, I could catch it. All right, and so I pushed pretty hard, and I was running as fast as I possibly could, and I still wasn't quite going to make it. So I dove for it. And as soon as my hands made contact with the ball, my face made contact with the block wall that the gym was made out of. And that wall was unwavering. And I don't know if you remember glacier glasses, but my teacher made me wear them at school for almost a month, like sunglasses with the leather things on the side so that they covered up your face. That's how swollen and discolored my face was, all right? I hit that wall with everything I had. It didn't move, and it didn't mind that I hit it. So that's what this author is saying, that we should be like, all right? We should hold on to this hope so tightly and with such a foundation that we do not waver no matter what hits us. And so there's a principle here that he's trying to turn them on to, and that's that our stability in negative circumstances directly correlates to the degree to which we can hold on to hope. I mean, we all know this, right? Doesn't the crap at work get easier to deal with when it's Friday? All right, don't we start using a countdown to vacation to deal with the troubles that we run into in life? Only 2 weeks till spring break. I can do this, right? So the hope of good things to come helps us to endure. And the funny thing is that our weekends and our vacations very often don't work out like we think they're gonna. All right, they may not work out at all. All right, your car may break down, you might get sick, your kids might get kidnapped, okay? Anything could happen on vacation, and it could make your vacation or your weekend so that it really kind of sucks, but we still look forward to them, all right? We're still not going to be at work, all right? So we all know this. As uncertain as these things are, weekends and vacations and new purchases, okay, all the things that we live for, we continue to place hope in them. But he's saying that this hope for eternity is certain. It's in the bank. Man, we can count on it, and we can latch onto it in order to help us keep from wavering. And so, Paul gives us the secret to weathering difficult times. This is in Romans 8. It says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us." So the word that he uses here for consider is an accounting term. He's talking about like making a ledger entry in a column, and that entry is his sufferings. And Paul knows a thing or two about suffering. All right, read like 2 Corinthians 11 sometime. Hardly anyone has suffered as much as Paul did. And the Bible doesn't at all minimize suffering. It's terrible to go through things, and some of us have suffered through incredibly painful things. And Paul says that we should consider that. But he's also saying that there's another column in the ledger, and that's where we record the hope of God. And he says in this passage that he compares it with the glory that is to be revealed to us. So if we have a clear view of the hope that God has given us, our circumstances should pale in comparison. And the result is stability. Okay, we can stay upright and unwavering. And so, like, how often do we even talk about this hope? When was the last time that you got out the Bible and went through the passages with your family about like being with God forever? It's difficult to consider a thing very seriously if we don't even really think about it. So this is the thing that Paul lived for. This is the thing that gave Paul stability in hardship. So what's the thing that you live for? And does it do the same thing for you? All right, third response. And it is to consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. All right, so just the fact that he says one another here clearly implies that Christianity is not meant to be carried out in isolation. So the idea that you would have a mature Christian that's not involved with one another isn't even contemplated by the Bible. Okay, and not only are we supposed to be around other people, but the type of involvement that we're supposed to have is fairly aggressive. All right, so if the book of Acts is any indication, then it's a lot of time and a lot of energy put into other Christians. Okay, but he says here that we should stimulate one another, kind of a strong word, right? In this context, I think that an even better translation would be to incite one another, like to incite a riot. And so when we get together with other Christians, God's intention is that we would like sort of wade in there and stir the water up. All right, we should affect the people that we interact with. And so some of us like to pull pigtails, right? We have an irrepressible urge to smack our wives' butt when we walk by, or tickle our daughter, or push our son just a little bit, okay? Anything to provoke a response of some kind. I didn't say me. Okay? Although I do admit that I often fall into this category. Okay? So I don't do these things as often as I would like to, but I always want to do them. Always. All right? So we're just like wired to provoke the people around us. And right here's our chance. Okay? This is what it's talking about. We're supposed to provoke and incite. But we're supposed to incite people to love one another, not incite them to irritation like maybe we're accustomed to, some of us. We're supposed to be provoking people to care for one another, all right, and to give themselves away for someone else. So we also need to look at where he uses this word consider. Okay, we absolutely cannot stimulate someone to love and good deeds unless we consider how to do that. This means we actually have to think about other people. We have to sit down when we're not with a person and think about how we can motivate them in their relationship with God. That's a novel idea for some of us. Okay? We aren't maybe naturally like this. Doesn't come like easily. Some of us rarely think about anyone at all other than ourselves. If we do think about someone else, it's often about like how much they bug us, or about something that they were supposed to do but didn't, or about how they messed up the things that they did do. I may have just disclosed too much about my own internal life. But this passage says to consider how to stimulate to love and good deeds. He's asking us to apply our creativity and our intellect to thinking about other people when we're not with them in a way that will help them in their spiritual walk. So if we think about the benchmarks of Christian maturity and the things that separate like one person's ministry efforts from another, this is the type of thing that makes the difference. A person that prayerfully considers how to affect the lives around them has a huge impact on a community. If you could get a room full of people like that, if you could get a home church full of people that are willing to do this, that's the kind of thing that changes the world. All right, and I realize that it's hard to think about other people. All right, and our own circumstances always seem like they're very difficult. And that's exactly what we tell ourselves to justify the fact that our eyes are only for our own circumstances. All right, so we do have hard things to deal with, and we are very busy. And we all have reasons to feel like there is no way that we can take our eyes off our own negative circumstances long enough to think about other people. So how can we do that? All right, and especially when you're someone like me, who has no predisposed bent towards thinking positively about other people. All right, well, the way that we do it is by reflecting on what God has done for us. God died for us. He's made a way for relationship with us. He cares for us and helps us grow. He's locked in our future so that we're secure for eternity. Okay, so do you think you could afford to trust him for long enough to take our eyes off of ourselves and focus on somebody else for a minute? Right, so that's how you do this. And it even works for me when I do it. So the very last line of our passage this morning says, "But encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." Says that we should encourage one another. So this is just like coming alongside and helping someone to keep going when they don't want to, right? Like calling out to a marathon runner, but not heckling, right? Not heckling a marathon runner. That's not the same thing. And so the idea of encouragement is that like a person's tired. They're not sure if they can keep going. And so the things that you decide to say should help them to keep going. And there are people here that need this right now. And some of you know that a word of encouragement at just the right time can change the course of your life. Encouragement is life-giving. And this author is challenging us to embrace that as an idea. All right, so notice that we have these three responses here. And above the red line, we're seeing this emphasis like draw near to God, hold on to the confessions of our hope. All right, so these things are oriented towards God. It's an us and God type of thing. Below the red line, the orientation is like between us and others. And so this is instruction on how we interact in these two different planes. And the idea of loving God and loving others should sound vaguely familiar. All right, that's because it's in the Bible. All right, this is Jesus having an interaction with the religious leaders of his day. And so they ask him, Teacher, which is the great commandment of the law? And the first part of his answer says very clearly the same kind of thing that the author of Hebrews is saying here. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. And then he says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So again, Jesus is giving instruction that matches with what we're seeing here in the book of Hebrews. And it's as we cultivate the habit of practicing this type of lifestyle, loving God and loving others, that we can find ourselves within a framework that is the framework that God has set up for our Christian growth. All right? But we can never, ever forget that the framework is built on the foundation of what Christ has done for us first.